Thank you all for coming to today's Millbank Tweed Forum, also hosted by the NYU Law Magazine. As in past years, today's roundtable conversation will be featured in the magazine, which our communications department issues every fall. The roundtable celebrates our broad intellectual community, bringing alums and faculty together with expertise concerning some of the most important issues of our time. Today's topic is certainly that, and I know we're all eager to hear our experts discuss it, so I'll just take a moment to thank our distinguished guests for taking the time to be here today, each of whom is introduced in your program, and particularly Ignacio Moreno for serving as moderator. I also want to single out Jeannie Kim, our managing editor, for all the work she's put into planning and organizing this event. And if you don't get enough of our own Ricky Revesz views today, he and his co-author, Jack Linke, will be giving a book talk just across the street in Lipton Hall on Wednesday, February the 17th at 6 on their just-published Struggling for Air, Power Plants, and the War on Coal. Thank you all for joining us today.
Good afternoon and welcome. I'm pleased to be here today with this esteemed panel of experts on one of the most important issues confronting the nation and the world at large, climate change. Our panelists bring deep and diverse expertise on the topic, as well as rich perspectives, which they will share with you. My role on this panel is going to be to facilitate the conversation. We have just a short window to address a very broad, complicated topic. So what I'm hoping to do is to have enough of a conversation to wet your whistle so that you will go out and become engaged and curious about what you hear today. So with that, I will start the panel discussion, and there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions toward the end of the program. My first question is going to be for Ricky Revesz and Ambassador Boyden Gray, starting with Ricky. The United States has taken a series of significant actions domestically and abroad to address climate change since President Obama's 2013 Climate Action Plan. The U.S. has pledged to reduce greenhouse gas emissions domestically by 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. The Clean Power Plan has even more ambitious goals. The Environmental Protection Agency has issued a number of major rules, including, as I just mentioned, the Clean Power Plan to reduce carbon emissions from new and existing power plants. Most recently, the U.S. played a leadership role at the UN Climate Change Conference in Paris to negotiate and sign a historic accord to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change. With less than a year remaining in President Obama's term and challenges to the legality of the Clean Power Plan making their way through the federal courts for some time to come, let's look ahead. What actions, if any, would you advise a newly elected president to take in his or her first 100 days in office to address climate change? As part of your answer, you can assume that either a Democrat or a Republican has been sworn into office on January 20th, 2017. Ricky?
Thank you, Ignacia. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you for moderating it. So if you give me the choice, I'll assume a Democrat has been elected and sworn into office. And I think Boyd and I are probably, our interests are well aligned here. He'll do a better job addressing one. I'll probably have given some thought to this question. So I'm assuming that the Clean Power Plan, which as Ignacia mentioned is a centerpiece of the climate change policy of the current administration. It is a very ambitious regulation that would control the greenhouse gas emissions of power plants. I'm assuming that the Clean Power Plan will be upheld. Obviously, as a legal challenge, there is going to be argument before the DC Circuit in June. I assume there's going to be a decision of the DC Circuit in September. And I'm assuming that the case will be reviewed in the court, and so the review will be pending at the time the new president takes office. But there at that point, the issue will be before the Supreme Court, and the court will decide this one way or the other. I'm also assuming that congressional action to address climate change in a comprehensive way is not in the cards, at least not for the new president's first term. We can debate that later, but my answer is assuming that. So here's the problem. The Clean Power Plan is very important, but it's not enough to meet the Paris commitment. So the question is where to go next. We can keep going down the road we've been going. And the road we've been going is essentially to tackle this problem industry by industry. So we're tackling it for power plants. And now there are new proposed regulations for methane releases from oil and gas extraction that applies only to new facilities, and also there are proposed regulations for extractions from federal lands that applies to both new and existing facilities. So that's sort of the second sector of the economy. And we could go down others, refineries and so on. Doing what we've been doing has two serious problems. One is that it's very cumbersome. Getting one of these rules out is an enormous undertaking of years of regulatory work followed by years of litigation. And the second problem is that the way to do this work at the lowest possible cost is by having broad trading. And I think most people assume that these rules allow trading only within the industry to which the rule applies. So when you start going down this path for a new industry, you could have trading there, but only for that industry. And so therefore, you don't get the advantage that broader trading would bring in terms of reducing costs further. There is a solution to this problem that the new president could announce. I mean, he couldn't put out the rule in the first 100 days, but he could announce that this process was launched. And this is a section of the Clean Air Act that has not been used much in the past. It's called Section 115. And this section authorizes the Environmental Protection Agency to require states to address emissions that endanger public health and welfare in other countries. But in order to do that, a finding must be made that other countries are taking reciprocal measures which would therefore benefit the US. Now, the Paris talks and what will follow from that provide a good basis, or at least if they work that out the way they are expected to work out, they provide a good basis for making the reciprocity finding. And so my advice to the president would be to announce that the administration will make the reciprocity finding as soon as the finding can be appropriately supported based on the Paris commitments. Then to use Section 115 as sort of a one-stop effort to regulate greenhouse gases from the major sectors of the economy that affect that. And that eventually, once that is in place, to fold the 111D, which is the section used to justify the Clean Power Plan, to fold that trading mechanism into this broader Section 115 mechanism. Now, one last word about congressional action. I think the best hope for a comprehensive congressional approach here, which would clearly be better because doing this under the Clean Air Act has certain clunkiness, it's inevitable. The best hope for a congressional approach is to have a number of elements in place already. If the conversation is, should we regulate the greenhouse gas emissions from stationary sources or should we not? I don't think Congress is going to act. And the filibuster rules in the Senate make it very difficult. On the other hand, if the question is, should we continue down our current path with quite comprehensive regulation of greenhouse gas emissions through executive action, or should we replace that with a more cost-effective approach that Congress can come up with? I think then the political conversation will shift. But I don't think it will have shifted during the president's first term, and that's why I predicted that there would not be comprehensive congressional action during the president's first term, but maybe the second term.
Thank you, Ricky. Boyden, what do you think about that, and what advice would you give the president?
Well, let me first thank you for including me in this very high-level group, and also for permitting me to do this by technology rather than the Acela. So what I would say is that I will assume that, as I think you would assume that I would assume, that a Republican would be the president. And I would advise him, not that he would listen, but I would advise him to use what authority has to free up competition in the fuels market, primarily on the transportation side, because that's where the glitches are. Free up competition for the fuels market so that lower carbon fuels can compete in an open market, level playing field. EPA does a lot to gum things up, and we had a little indication of that in Iowa, where ethanol sort of appeared ugly. But ethanol is much better greenhouse fuel than gasoline. Now, to get to the major point about how to regulate all this, I am in complete agreement, and maybe this is the only thing I'm in complete agreement, but I am in complete agreement with your former dean, my former dean, because I did teach at NYU, that the best way to do this is by emissions trading. I don't think Section 115 is a viable method of doing it. It's based on there being a criteria pollutant regulation under Section 110, which is has been foreclosed by EPA and is foreclosed by its invocation of 111D, which can't apply to the criteria of pollutants. What I would encourage the president to do is to think about a kind of deal, because I will hold Ricky's words against him that EPA is clunky and difficult to manage. I mean, using the Clean Air Act to do this. And I would encourage a kind of grand bargain where you do a cap and trade or carbon tax. Those two choices are subject to debate as to which one is the better. And whether you use an auction with the cap and trade, if that's the way you go. And I would hope that whatever happens and whatever revenue is generated is used in a revenue-neutral way to reduce, say, the corporate income tax. But if you have a cap and trade level, or you have a corporate tax, a carbon tax, which is designed to do the trick, then you would suspend, in order to get the Republican votes, you would say as long as that is in place, there is no EPA jurisdiction at all over any greenhouse gases. Now that is something which a lot of people kind of choke on, on both sides of the aisle. I think Republicans could be brought along. I've been told that the environmental groups think they can bring their crowd along. I don't know what the truth to either assertion. I've been told by very serious environmental advocates that this will never happen. They would never give up EPA jurisdiction. So I don't know, but that's what I would encourage, and I think that's what I think would provide the best solution to all of this. A congressional adopted bipartisan cap and trade or carbon tax that replaces EPA's piecemeal regulation.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Nat. You're an economist by training. You're at the Environmental Defense Fund. You've worked on these issues for quite some time. What do you think about the idea of a grand bargain and market-based approaches to addressing climate change?
Thanks, Ignacia, and thanks for including me on the panel. So let me start with the particular question, and then I want to pull back a little bit also and think about the 100 days and the broader, even beyond the 100 days, maybe the next 10 years or 20 years.
I was going to ask you about the beyond the 100 days.
Excellent. So I'll start with the market. I'll start with the grand bargain. I think, I think it would be great if we could get a grand bargain. I think Boyden is right that the environmental community will not support anything that entirely removed the EPA's authority to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. And so I think that's a dead end. But that doesn't mean you couldn't have a grand bargain of some sort, because you could imagine ways in which EPA authority could be latent, or it could be a backstop. You could imagine, indeed, if you start thinking about a carbon tax, from an economist's point of view and a revenue point of view, there are lots of things that economists in academia like about a carbon tax. From an environmental advocate point of view, the problem is it doesn't have a limit. It doesn't have a limit on emissions, and ultimately what we have to do is stop putting pollution into the air. We don't just need to put a price on it, we need to stop putting it into the air. But you can imagine the kind of outlines of a grand bargain that maybe used the EPA's Clean Air Act authority as that backstop, as that guarantee on emissions reductions, but basically said, let's try to use a tax or a hybrid policy, a market-based policy instrument to get the reductions we need, and then we won't use that EPA Act authority until, or the Clean Air Act authority, unless it looks like we're not making our targets. So I think that would be the grand bargain. The only thing I'll add to Ricky is that if I were addressing the new president, I would make sure to say, Madam President, and see what she and think about what she would want. But I think Ricky has laid out a very interesting proposal. Let's say we can maybe talk more about Section 115.
Sure.
If I step back and think about the 100 days and put it in context, I spent a couple weeks in December along with Bryce and many others in Paris at the UN Conference of the Parties, the UN Climate Talks, which produced a great successful outcome. We can talk more about that. But the fact that Paris reached an agreement also puts in place a timeline that's relevant to the 100 days question. So 100 days comes right at the end of April or early May, right? And that's also when the new Paris Agreement will be open for signing over at the UN headquarters on the East River. And so within that first 100-day window will come the first chance for, sorry, I'm confused, I guess 100 days of this year, right?
Right, right.
But the fact that that happens soon, that happens so rapidly, means that the agreement for the Paris Agreement may well come into force much sooner than people are thinking. It may well come into force not in 5 years or 4 years or 3 years, but within this year. And that means that indeed the 100 days of the next administration need to be thinking about how to implement the Paris Agreement, how to implement the international climate agreement, and how to do the work of writing the modalities and the rules and the guidelines that need to be done to implement that. So I think that will be an important part of the overall challenge for the next president. Let me finish by saying, I think in terms of broader ambition, you mentioned, Ignacia, the Clean Power Plan and the ambitious U.S. targets for 2025. And Ricky pointed to this as well, and I think Boyden actually made this implicit in his response. The current administration, the Obama administration, has done a terrific job of putting in place the first ever series of regulations through the Clean Air Act on power plant emissions, and starting, as Ricky said, on other sectors. The Paris Agreement is a great step forward for the UN. Neither of them is anywhere close to enough to tackle the problem. And so the main thing we need to start thinking about now is how to raise the ambition, of the steps that countries take under the Paris Agreement, and how to raise the ambition of the United States. If we're going to meet the 2025 targets that have been laid out, we need to be putting in much more in place than the Clean Power Plan or the other regulations on the way. And if we're going to go beyond 2025 to the kind of cuts we would need in 2030 and beyond, we're going to need entirely new instruments. Maybe that's Section 115. I think we need to start thinking, though, about how to get congressional legislation in place. Ricky's laid out one pathway, starting with Clean Air Act regulation and creating pressure that way. Boyden's laid out another in terms of the grand bargain. But one way or another, we're going to need more ambitious legislation in place.
Thank you. Just as a clarifying point, the Paris Agreement will be open for signature starting April 22nd, 2016, and then will close for signature April 22nd, 2017. So as Nat said, there are some key action steps this year, but that 100-day window will come toward the end of that period. Question is, when will the president sign the agreement, and importantly, what is going to be the ratification mechanism for him to be able to deposit those instruments with the UN? Having clarified, I'm going to pivot to a couple of folks here. I'd like to go to Carl next, but then I'd like Amy and Bryce to talk a little bit more about Paris, some of the deadlines, and in particular the ambition built in for the parties as as the decades flow by. There are a lot of timeframes that I'd like to get on the table. Carl, let me go to you first, though, because we've been talking about market-based mechanisms, which the Paris Agreement describes as cooperation. A lot of meat on the bones is going to be put on that in the coming years, and you've heard Boyden and Ricky and Nat address some aspects of that. What is your view on market-based mechanism opportunities, and would you address China while you're at it?
I'm not sure I can address China, but I'll take a shot at market-based. I think that we've already actually seen in the United States a market-based response that has reduced greenhouse gases largely without a lot of government hands in the mix in what's happened with the replacement of coal by natural gas. One of the things that I find very interesting about these discussions is that people talk about, what's going to happen in 2050, which is 35 years ago. Well, 10 years ago, if you had asked most experts, where does the United States position on natural gas, they would have said, well, we're going to have to be importing a lot of it here very quickly because we're running out. Now we know through technological change that we have vast quantities of natural gas, and the private sector has been utilizing that gas to produce power. I think last year was the first time that gas-fired generation exceeded coal-fired generation in the United States in decades, and you get somewhere between a 2-to-1 to 3-to-1 reduction in carbon dioxide by using natural gas versus coal. So I think it's an illustration, in my mind, if you have the right economic incentives, there's a lot that can be accomplished. I think we're going to have a very interesting experiment going on in Germany right now. I think watching what's happened in Germany and how they progress with their very aggressive program to move to solar and wind as part of their energy mix, and a very interesting juxtaposition with what's happening in France. Nobody talks about France very much, but it gets 75% of its electricity through nuclear. It doesn't produce a molecule of carbon dioxide, that 75%. And so I think that certainly that's a very interesting comparison. If you look at what's happening in France, what's happening in Germany, and it'll be an interesting model, in my view, of what might possibly work in the United States. And I'll just say this one thing. I think it's important to focus on Washington, what the president might do, what the Congress might do. But I think for any of these programs to work, it also has to resonate with the other 330 million people in the United States out there. And it's got to be something that makes sense to them, that does not cause electric power to be unreliable, and does not cause it to be outrageously expensive. Otherwise, I don't know that you can actually solve this problem just through promulgating a new regulation from Washington.
Amy?
I can't agree more. I think that what we need to accomplish is well beyond the regulatory possibilities or legislative possibilities, frankly. And I think that in order to get where we really need to go based on the science will involve the private sector and the citizenry of the world. And so I think, yes, I love the backstop idea of EPA. EPA has to be our backstop. EPA protects the people and the environment of this country anyway, and has played a huge role in changing the global reaction to pollution. But I don't think we can regulate our way exclusively out of this. So I think the notion of enhancing incentives, the moonshot idea of investing in clean technology, the Bill Gates consortium that is looking at how you really will get to the changes in technology, private sector, something the government's not particularly great at. We're good at putting money into it, but at least in my experience, I saw some less successful outcomes, if you will, that I think appropriately, the government is doing long-term research and investment in great science, but that doesn't always lead to the breakthroughs that we need to get where we absolutely have to get to deal with global warming, or climate change, as we should be calling it. So I think that the tools that we have, I think the tax tool is a very effective one with a backstop of regulatory or legislative power. But I think that the change that will come from Paris and the change that we've seen from the mercury and air toxic standard, from the cross-boundary rule, from the threat of 115, from the Clean Power Plan, is its impact on the private sector. And so I think what we really need to be doing, and what I hope a lot of you in the audience will be doing, is thinking about how you can play a leadership role there. What are the tools that we have? You all will be leading these companies, or you'll be leading advocacy groups that can accomplish change. So that's what I think should happen in the next 30 years, but hopefully sooner.
Thank you. Bryce, if you could, as part of your answer, address the Paris Agreement. Much is made about this agreement, but is it really different? How is it different? And given how many commitments of their parties are left to be made in many years to come, is this really going to be a pivot point?
Yes, I want to get to that, but I want to sort of follow up on sort of something that Amy and Nat and Carl were also mentioning about the engagement of the private sector. So these international conferences that happen every year, the Conference of the Parties, the one that happened in Paris was actually held at an old airport, and we were essentially meeting in what were airplane hangars. And down the middle there was a street which they had called the Champs-Élysées. And on one side, there was a bunch of halls in which the negotiators and government officials met and scurried around and traded pieces of paper with text on it. And on the other side of the Champs-Élysées was another set of airplane hangars that was all private sector and NGOs. And while the government people were doing negotiations, the private sector and NGOs were actually making announcements about new actions that were happening. And sometimes these actions were happening with government support, often they were not. And this went on actually for 8 days, sector by sector, and announcements were coming out. A tremendous number of announcements. I think it was about 75 new global initiatives, many of which did not involve governments. So the private sector is engaged in a way that I don't think we've seen them before, and so I think that's really important. So that's the first bit that I would say is different about what's happening now than what's been happening in the past. The agreement itself is, in many senses, radically different than what has come before, in two ways. One, the number of countries that have been participating. So the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, signed in '92, and then in the Kyoto Protocol, a couple of years later, or a few years later, had commitments from only the developed countries, so just under 40 countries. In Cancun, a greater number of countries made commitments. These were, of course, non-legally binding, and that was about 100 countries. But now, with the new Paris Agreement, we have 187 countries, potentially 188, that have put in commitments of what they're going to do nationally, and this covers 99% of emissions. So just in terms of coverage, it's fairly significant. Second, it's different in the old system was very top-down. You had a global amount that needed to be reduced. This was allocated amongst the countries that were making reductions, and they got a number that they had to meet. What has happened under the Paris Agreement is countries have nationally determined what they're going to do. And I think what is important about that is that these national determinations of their contributions generally happen through domestic processes, domestic consultative processes, in which countries went through and said, okay, this is what we're able to do in transport, in energy, and looked across their entire economy. And these are the policies they could put into place, and then they added up these policies and they got to a number. So for the US, it was 26 to 28%. For the EU, it's between 30 and 40%. And so I think that's important because no longer is there just sort of a number out there and countries are trying to figure out how they meet that number, but rather they have now potentially these plans that they can sort of put into place domestically.
Have you given some thought to, Ricky's suggestion that we look at Section 115? And when I say we, I mean the United States looks to Section 115. How does that factor in to the Paris commitments?
Well, I don't know heaps about 115, so I'll leave that mostly to Ricky. But I think part of the trigger is that other countries are taking action. And there are a number of other countries that are already taking action. And we will see more of them in the coming years.
Nat?
I wanted to pick up on this private sector point. I say this as somebody who was involved in several of the initiatives that Bryce talks about and was sort of helping to orchestrate some of the kind of NGO private sector coalitions that were announced in Paris and that were announced in the New York Climate Summit that took place back in 2014. And I say this as coming from an NGO that spent a lot of time working with private companies. But I have enough of the economist in me to say that it's not going to happen without clear, strong, well-designed government policy. That you'll get a handful of leading companies that make commitments on their own because they see it as being in their business interest. But for us to really get the reductions we need government to put in place the kind of incentives, the market signals that come from government policy that could come out of an economy-wide cap and trade system through Section 115 that Ricky's talking about, or the kind of carbon tax or emissions trading system through legislation that Boyden is talking about. Carl, you mentioned the role of markets in the natural gas, in what we've seen, the decline of coal in the U.S. electric power sector and the rise of natural gas. Markets did play a role. Clearly, cheap natural gas has played a big role, but so did regulations, and actually not even the kind of economically efficient, cost-effective regulations that Boyden and Ricky and I would like to see. Good old-fashioned EPA, close that plant down kind of regulations under the hazardous air pollutants and toxics provisions of the Clean Air Act, done in response to the public health threat posed by coal plants. So even that story is one where regulation has played a key role. So I think we need to keep in mind that it's going to be government policies and hopefully economically sound, economically efficient, market-based policies that put a price on carbon and a limit on carbon that create those incentives for the private sector to get involved.
Boyden, would you like to respond to that? I know that you've expressed a different, let's call it, framework for proceeding. What do you say to Nat in addition to what you said earlier?
Well, I think it's important for me to reinforce some of the earlier comments about, the alternatives that are out there. Natural gas is a product which is very clean. It's not pure, but it's very clean, and it's potential not just some would realize already in the stationary source power sector, but it's potentially a major player in the mobile source sector, and that's where EPA has been a real roadblock. And MIT's done an enormous amount of work on this. And natural gas can be used as a fuel on its own, compressed natural gas or liquefied natural gas for heavy-duty trucks, or it can be converted to methanol, or it could be converted to ethanol. And it could be the basis for the real home run, which is hydrogen. But that won't happen if the regulations aren't revised to provide for a level playing field, whatever is done about climate change. And I believe if there were really a level playing field, and that's suggested in the report, the big 91-page report on Section 115, if there were cross-sector trading permitted, which EPA has never indicated any toleration for, where you have utilities trading with automobile companies or oil companies or refineries. If you had that kind of open market just under the existing law, I think you would find enormous innovation that would end up reducing carbon, even without having directly put a price on carbon or a limit on carbon.
Ricky?
I totally agree with Boyden that having cross-sector trading would be a very good thing, and I think it would be allowed under Section 115. It would clearly be allowed under legislation if it provided for that. But I think that is actually something we should really be pushing for, because we're not going to realize these cost reduction potentials unless we do. On level playing field, I'm a big fan, basically, of removing all subsidies and. But the only way we can really create a level playing field is by internalizing the pollution externality. Because otherwise we're subsidizing the dirty energy producers, not with money, but with people's lives and with environmental harm. So the only way to have a level playing field is to internalize it. And there are many ways to do it, and Boyden suggested one. Basically, no subsidies and a tax on greenhouse gas emissions equal to the social cost of carbon would do the trick. Or to pick a tool that Nat likes better, deriving some number out of that that's the cap on emissions would also do the trick. And if we got this right, the price for this trading might be the social cost of carbon. So there are ways of getting there. But I think when we talk about a level playing field, we have to talk about a level playing field that internalizes the externality. Otherwise, it's not a level playing field. It's just a different kind of subsidy.
Carl?
Well, I understand that point, but I think that in the short term, I mean, one thing that we could do today is to encourage the building of pipelines from Pennsylvania into the South so that companies like the Southern Company and other areas that are totally dependent on coal can have access to natural gas while we continue to support research. The solution to this problem is probably not known today. When you think about the technological changes that have occurred over the last 30 years, I know other people want to talk about, I'll make this real quick, but you know, everybody talks about fracking and natural gas, but the real technological breakthrough was computer-controlled drilling that allows you to take a 6-inch pipe, send it 2 miles, and keep it within 75 feet of where you want it. That's a real technological breakthrough. Massive computing power and 3D seismic make that happen. And I believe as we look at the course of technological change, there will be other things that come along. But in the meantime, you know, we don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We take advantage of the opportunities that are in front of us while we look for these other solutions.
Nat?
Well, I was going to talk about natural gas, but let me wait on that, and let me pick up the point on technological innovation, which I think Amy also raised, and I'll just throw it out there that there's been lots of great work, and many of us around the table and Boyden have worked on various ways, as Ricky says, how do you design a cap and trade program for the U.S. Boyden was involved in the sulfur dioxide trading program. That's kind of the template for that. That was back in the 1990 Clean Air Act, extremely successful, which provides one of the sort of templates for how we might manage greenhouse gases. You know, Ricky talked about Section 115. We've had attempts in Congress. One area where there's been much less, I think, a clear sense of how, what the policy tools would be and how you would move forward is on this issue of technological innovation. And it's one that partly as a result, I think, doesn't get enough attention. Amy mentioned the private sector's role in innovation, and that's really critical, including the announcement by Bill Gates and 30 of his billionaire friends that they'll put huge amounts of private capital into innovative clean tech. That's great. But alongside, as Amy, as you know, and as others know, alongside that announcement came an announcement from the U.S. government and other countries to double the R&D spending. And while government R&D spending is not on its own enough to drive technological change, it can play a role. It actually played a role in some of the technologies that turned into horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing. But more importantly, I think it can play a role in driving clean technology innovation. It has to be well designed. There are some lessons we can learn from what the Obama administration and others have tried. But there's one of the important things, and the point I want to make is there's much more that needs to be done in terms of developing smart, effective policy approaches to driving technological change relative to kind of what we know about in terms of how to design a cap and trade program or carbon tax. They can help, but they're not going to get us all the way, and we need the kind of technological breakthroughs that Amy and Carl have talked about.
Amy, would you like to address that?
Well, I agree.
On the lessons learned?
Oh, on the lessons learned, I think that I think it is, the government is kind of a blunt instrument, and it is not going to be like a California investor who can really ferret out, the next, I don't know, Groupon, which is going to be very successful. But they can play a role in opening that world up, and they play a very, very important role in the longer-term research at the energy labs. And I think one reform that might be really helpful with the energy labs is to encourage them to do more partnerships, which they basically do. I mean, they do a ton of partnerships with the private sector, but if they were given a mandate that this is the #1 undertaking for you to be studying, and bring in your partners, I think that would really, really move things along quicker. And I think it would have a very willing audience of participants and partners who see their own benefits from this kind of partnership and from the outcome, because the writing's on the wall. We are going to have to get off carbon in the next, hopefully, 30 years. That's going to be very hard. And I think that we can do it, but I think it's going to require pretty much crowdsourcing in government, and crowdsourcing in the private sector, and crowdsourcing in the individual person sector and community level. And that's hard to organize. It's really hard to organize, but to the extent I think that's great. If we could kind of map out ways to leverage these outcomes more systemically, that would be awesome.
We've, Carl.
Well, I'll just add that the government has a wonderful test bed that it could use to check out a number of these ideas called the Tennessee Valley Authority. The government doesn't need any regulation to tell the Tennessee Valley Authority what to do. It owns it. It is also one of the largest coal-fired electrical generators in the United States. But they also have nuclear plants, and they have hydro plants, and they have programs for solar and wind. And, it's the government's utility. And what a great place. It's situated, its headquarters situated in Knoxville, right next to the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. What a great place to try and work out some of these issues.
We talked earlier about a grand bargain, and others thought there could be no grand bargain as proposed. It seems like we might be stuck. We're talking about these different approaches, market-based approaches, cap and trade systems, that everyone thinks would be a good idea, maybe as part of a mix. But how do we get there? How do we get there from here? What can we look at by way of existing authority versus getting congressional action, which doesn't seem very encouraging right now? What is the path to get us from here to there? And I just open it up to anyone on the panel. Nat?
Let me take a stab, and I'm going to take less of a policy perspective than a political perspective.
Right.
Because I guess I start from the premise that we need much, much greater ambition, both in terms, we need more ambitious policies in place to meet the 2025 target that the president has put out, but we need much more ambitious targets in 2030. And one of the lessons from Paris, I think, is that one reason we saw, and Bryce, I imagine you'd agree, one reason we saw success in Paris is real leadership from the U.S. That wasn't the only reason. The French did a masterful job of diplomacy. The Chinese have come along a huge way. But U.S. leadership in a way that we hadn't seen in the previous 12 years, previous 15, 20 years, 18 years maybe, or maybe ever, depending on what you think about Kyoto. Real U.S. leadership was something that had been lacking, and I think it showed what that could do. And that's also going to be critical if we're going to get the world to get to the kind of ambitious place that the science demands. And in turn, that means, so I come back to saying we're going to have to change the politics in the U.S. Because without changing the politics in the U.S., we won't be able to get the kind of action at home that we need, and we won't be able to get that leadership, and we just won't make it. So 115 is a brilliant way of using, potentially brilliant way of using, I don't want that sort of written in the New York Law magazine before I've really vetted it, but potentially brilliant way of using existing authority. But we need to change the politics, and that has to, I think, start with, I think that means building a bipartisan conversation again in this country. It's only, it was 2008 when John McCain was running for the Republican presidency, calling for a cap-and-trade program that was as ambitious in the out years as what President Obama proposed. And so we have to figure out a way to get back to that. I don't mean to put you on the spot, Boyden. It would be great to hear your thoughts, because there's a part of the Republican Party that is unfortunately awfully vocal and loud at this time of year and this time of presidential cycle that has really taken a stand of denialism against climate change. But there are also leaders in the Republican Party. Chris Gibson from upstate New York is one of them. Sadly, he's leaving the Congress on his own volition, but who have stood up and said, I think this is a problem. We need to do something about it. And I think we're really only going to start getting places in this country when Republican support for climate change policy stops being a badge of honor, a badge of courage, and starts being the politically smart thing to do. And that's going to take a lot of political work, but I think we need to figure out how to do it.
We'll go to Boyden, and I guess my role is to put you on the spot, so if you would respond to that, and then I'd like to go to Bryce.
Well, as a general matter, I don't want to get involved in a debate about whether or to what extent human beings and CO2 and methane and CFCs and HCFCs and whatnot, how much they contribute, what percentage. I'm a lawyer, I'm a layman, I don't know the science, but I still am impressed by the position that President Bush 41 took, which is, a no regrets policy. You do when you have a choice, and it's not more expensive, in a significant way to take climate or some other externality into account. You do it anyway. You do it because it's a hedge against the future, and nobody knows what the future is. And when we did, for example, the acid rain program, it went smoothly and it worked really well because no one really understood it when it was put in the law, and no one really cared about it, and so no one tried to game it. But when along came Waxman-Markey, the administration bill for CO2, and the gaming began and never ended. So if in order to do anything at all legislative, you'd have to have some sort of trade promotion authority or base closing kind of restriction on floor amendments, because otherwise it'll be chewed to death. But I think the point that there are 2 points that I think affect Republicans that are often reflected in ideological statements, but I think are perhaps generated by more mundane facts. And the first is, and this explains, I think, the massive vote against the Kyoto Protocol, is the fact that China and India aren't playing. I mean, you can use all the hype you want about this Paris Agreement, but what China was supposed to have agreed to do, but what China agreed to do was to level off in 2030. But until 2030, they can do any damn thing they want, and they can build power plants they don't even need up until 2030. And the baseline for them is 2030. It's not 2015 or 1990. And that's just an open invitation to game the system. And India's not really cooperating either. And so without those two, you're never going to get Republicans who are going to say, well, we're not going to put in rules that increase the price of energy for our manufacturers so that they will hightail it to China or to India or to some other less developed nation and get cheaper energy, but they're not going to do that. We've done that before. We've lost a lot of jobs before, and we're still losing jobs to China because of their traditional pollution. 25% or 20% of which ends up in California or in the Rockies, and we have to clean it up. Californians have to clean up the fine particle pollution that comes over from China, and it's very expensive, and some way ought to be found out to nail the Chinese for that. That would be a big, big plus. That would really get the ball rolling in the right direction. But right now, they're given a green light to do whatever they want. And the second thing is, and this is something I'm just repeating myself, EPA's clunkiness is somebody else's terror, you know, and the people who have been subjected to EPA are in a state of panic, terror. They don't know what to do, and EPA is very vindictive. You know, I'm waiting for the Republican ad that shows EPA officials in Alaska toting guns. Now, why do you need an EPA official in Alaska with a gun? So a lot of the reaction in among Republicans is a reaction to the fact that China really isn't under the tent yet. They don't know how to measure this stuff. They admitted that they were burning a lot more carbon just a few weeks ago. They admitted that they had completely miscalculated last year's carbon output. They don't even have the measurement system, let alone the infrastructure to implement anything. And EPA continues to drive people crazy. The beauty of the acid rain program was that nobody knew it was happening, and the problems were so mundane that they never got hired as the chief financial officer. They never went into the general counsel or the head of external government relations. And there were some CEOs who didn't even know it existed. So because it never got to their desk. So there are ways to do this painlessly, but there's no reason why you have to use the root canal theory of regulation. That's what I used to call a lot of this case-by-case command and control is root canal. Why you have to have a root canal in order to have good. I mean, why not do a root canal at birth if that's what you? So I mean, I'm making a little bit fun of this, and maybe I shouldn't, but a lot of the Republican reaction is because of the overreaching or underreaching in the case of China that we've seen now for 2 decades.
I'm going to go to Bryce and then Nat, and I think some others want to join in here, and then we'll go to the audience. There are a number of things we started off looking at, but I think that Boyden also raised China, which I raised earlier in the conversation. Could you address that as part of your answer? The different, let's call them measures in little quote marks for the developed and developing nations, and put developing around quote marks as well, given the role of China.
So I think Nat was pretty right when he said that without U.S. leadership, and of course without the hand-holding and massaging that France did, we wouldn't have got an agreement in Paris. But I think, and sort of contrary to what Boyden has potentially just suggested, I think China's engagement in this agreement was almost as essential as the U.S.'s agreement. U.S.'s engagement. And though I said earlier that this was potentially the best deal that we could have gotten out of Paris, it certainly wasn't the deal that every individual country wanted out of Paris. And there were a number of developing countries that wanted much more hard commitments from developed countries, hard commitments on finance. And they didn't get those. And China was certainly a significant moderating force amongst the developing countries pushing towards this agreement. And so I think U.S. leadership continues to be essential, particularly in this very short term of the signing opening on April 22nd and the ratifications that can happen very soon after that. If the U.S., I assume Obama is going to want to do it while he's still president, both sign and accept the agreement. If the U.S. can bring along China in doing this, and they've had significant
Bilateral?
Yeah, they've had significant bilateral relationships and a significant agreement amongst the two. So if that can happen, I think we'll start to see a whole rush of countries really to start to ratify this new agreement.
Thank you. Nat?
Let me also pick up the thread on China, and Boyden, with all respect, I guess I get frustrated when I hear people make the China argument again. So for a little bit of history, in 1997, before the Clinton administration had finished negotiating the Kyoto Protocol, the U.S. Senate voted 98-0, I think, 97-0. It was the Byrd-Hagel resolution that basically said, don't bother bringing to the U.S. Senate any international agreement on climate that doesn't ask big developing countries like China and India to be part of the same framework as the U.S. Well, lo and behold, that's what we got out of Kyoto, and no surprise, it never got to the U.S. Senate. And the amount of the shift in how the Paris Agreement is constructed relative to Kyoto is fundamental. It's 180 degrees. Across the board, all references to Annex 1 of the Framework Convention and the 1992 Framework Convention, which puts countries into different buckets based on development, those are gone. The only mentions of developing and developed countries in the Paris Agreement are literally those words. They're never defined. That's the approach that's used in the WTO. And I never hear people talking about how the WTO is letting China get away with blah, this, that, and the other thing. Self-differentiation is a standard approach in international agreements. We have come so far. China's going to have a cap and trade program on its electric power sector in the next couple of years, well ahead of the U.S. having a national cap and trade program. So it really starts to feel like moving the goalposts. Chuck Hagel, who was the author, one of the authors of the Byrd-Hagel resolution, came out a couple months ago and said, the way this is headed, the way the Paris negotiations were headed, the Paris Agreement will satisfy the conditions that the Senate laid out for Byrd-Hagel. So the author of that resolution says, okay, so much has been done that we're in a different place and the Byrd-Hagel resolution no longer applies. The final irony is that the reason that there aren't enforceable, some sort of legally enforceable binding obligations in the Paris Agreement is because the U.S. Senate will not ratify an international agreement, and we're never going to get the 67 votes. And there's a very clear reason for that. So to then turn around and say, well, but it's not enforceable, and that means China can do what they want. I think it doesn't reflect the reality of the Paris Agreement, doesn't reflect the reality of what China is doing, and it doesn't reflect the reality of the politics at home. We are going to need, as Bryce said, a lot of work to make sure that the Paris Agreement lives up to its promise. We need a lot of work to improve the monitoring and reporting and verification to make sure that China does what it says it's going to do. We need a lot of work to get India on a low-carbon track. But I think to say that the Paris Agreement doesn't get India and China onto that track, and therefore, the U.S. shouldn't do anything at home. And I don't mean to say that that's what you're saying, Boyd, and that is what other people have said. I think that's a real mistake.
Before we go to the questions, I do want to ask Amy a question about the role of civil society. We've been talking about nationally determined contributions. That's at the heart of the agreement, and then based on common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Fair enough to say whatever you can do at your own pace within your capabilities. There's been some discussion about capacity building and the role of communities, and how do you see those forces? Because we've talked about a lot of different pieces of this, but what is the role of civil society and communities, indigenous people, as contemplated in the agreement, and as an action-forcing element to having the parties give it their best shot on the most ambition?
Okay, well, I will refer actually to Bryce on the Paris Agreement, because I'm less involved in that than I am on the Clean Power Plan. And the Clean Power Plan uniquely, I think, among EPA actions, really took lessons from the needs and different situations of communities. When EPA worked on improving the Clean Power Plan between its initial draft regulatory condition and the final regulation that it released, it spent a lot of time talking to communities, a ton of time, talking to people of color, talking to the private sector, talking to local government, with specific attention to environmental justice communities, which EPA is the keeper of the presidential executive order on environmental justice. They did something called a proximity analysis for all of the states. And the proximity analysis essentially looks at the main sources of pollution and who lives near them. And it wasn't just carbon. It was what we call criteria pollutants, the ones that make people really sick. Carbon makes the planet sick, but doesn't really make people sick. And they folded that analysis into the information that the states will have as they develop their state implementation plans. They also didn't mandate, but strongly encouraged the states, as they develop their state implementation plans, to pay close attention to environmental justice impacts and to have what they call meaningful public participation. What that means is that states are going to have to actually talk to their people as they develop their SIPs, which is something that began, I think it was happening maybe 15 years ago, but usually among elites, not among community members. I think this is huge. I think it's also politically very valuable because the environmental justice community has kind of been on the negative side of action to address climate change, being afraid that it would create sort of centers of pollution where they live, that they would end up not addressing the criteria health-based pollutants in a way that was meaningful as they dealt with carbon. But I think building these requirements into the Clean Power Plant has been very helpful. Plus, EPA did something smart and very consistent, I think, with this president's vision, which is that they mandated, this is not just a hortatory, this is a mandatory approach for state implementation plans followed up with money, that the distributional benefits of action to address carbon have to be equally, have to reach the environmental justice communities. And that means that when we start doing clean energy and clean energy jobs, that those will not all be where the rich people live. It will be happening to benefit communities of color and reduce the burden of environmental justice communities.
Thank you. I know Bryce wants just 1 minute to weigh in.
So I think one of the great things about the Paris Agreement is it tries to understand why countries comply and don't comply with the obligations or the commitments that they make. And so generally for developing countries, it's rarely that they don't comply because they don't want to comply, but often lack the capacity to do so. And so the Paris Agreement is good in that, first of all, the contributions that every country makes are nationally determined. No country is obligated to do something they don't think they're able to. But then, even understanding that countries may make commitments which they're not currently able to fulfill, there are a whole series of capacity building programs and technology transfer and financial transfer to help these countries come into compliance with those obligations they've taken upon themselves.
Thank you. I'd like to open the floor for questions from the audience. And if you would come to one of the two mics and give us your name, and then we'll take your questions. Don't be shy. I'm sure someone has a question out there. All questions are welcome. We have a taker over here.
Hi, my name is Michael. I have a question for Amy Saltzman. Recognizing, we talked a little bit about the gaming that went on with Waxman-Markey, and I just wonder if there were some lessons learned, on top of that or besides for that, in the failure of Waxman-Markey during the Obama administration?
Well, I think there are tons of lessons to be taken from that experience. One is that when you are president of the United States and you want to change two really huge things, healthcare and climate change, you got to stage it better. Healthcare, and we were watching. Healthcare went first. Damn, if only we had gone first, we would have won. The second is that you need to engage differently, I believe, than the administration did at the time. We essentially said, we want you to do this, and the president gave very loose guidelines, and then threw it into the backyard dogfight of Capitol Hill. I think had there been, and I think part of it was the exhaustion over healthcare reform, that had we been in there much more aggressively helping to shape and corral what was going on, we would have probably done better. I think in addition, the strategy on the Senate side could have been a little bit more robust and a little bit more successful. Playing the two houses against each other is a strategy that sometimes works. And I think that the political implications of people who really worked hard and voted hard on that piece of legislation, who didn't get support when they were running again, I think the party should have been behind them much more strongly than they were, because then it became riskier to support action in the next term. I think that the story of people losing their seat because they voted for Waxman Markey unfortunately had legs. And I think it contributed to where we are politically now. Nat, you probably have some thoughts too.
We have Nat and then Ricky.
So I'm going to take a very different position here, and this was, I was very involved in Waxman Markey, including in the drafting of the provisions, although I was at EDF at the time. You know, I think if you had said if you had said in June of 2008, okay, a year before, or certainly 2 years before, I guess by 2008 we had succeeded in getting it on the presidential circuit, but certainly 2 years before, if you had said, we're going to have the House of Representatives is going to pass a bill with economy-wide legislation on climate change that puts a cap-and-trade program through 2050, I think people said, that sounds pretty good. We enacted a bill in the House of Representatives. People like to, I mean, we forget about that because we failed to do it in the Senate, but that's like, you know, no mean feat. And the discussion about gaming, you know, your gaming is somebody else's, is somebody else's allocation to address energy prices and electricity prices and fuels prices. So the gaming, I think, has been pretty overstated by, you know, by some of the commentary. That's not to say that there were not lots of lessons we can learn, and I think mobilizing a broader set of constituencies is key. But I think one of the real lessons was, don't try to pass cap-and-trade legislation in the midst of the worst recession since the Great Depression. And we didn't know that that was happening at the time, but the lesson, I remember being in the Senate in 2010 trying to push the American Power Act through, and it was very clear that the senators already could see where their constituents were. The recession was already taking a huge toll, and there was no chance of getting anything ambitious through. So, you know, there are lessons, but I don't think we should overstate them, and we should recognize that we passed a bill in the House of Representatives, which I don't think we thought we could do.
Thank you. Ricky?
I think there's a lesson. If the situation never gets repeated, which might never happen. Remember, when the president took office, I think the Democrats had, 257 seats in the House and 60 seats in the Senate. And many of those people owed their election to the president. It wasn't that they were such great candidates for House and Senate seats. They were carried into office by the president's election. And so then he turned over the writing of these bills to these people who essentially owed him a lot and weren't called on to give back what they owed. I think that if the president had started out with a much more centrally planned bill, we might have ended up a lot better off. I mean, this connects a little bit to an issue that Jack Linke and I talk in our book, Struggling for Air, that Rebecca Carmichael talked about earlier. I mean, one of the problems is we had still a lot of existing planned power plants, many of which were very old and inefficient, and everyone sort of came to the table asking for things that wouldn't make them worse off. And at the end of the day, this bill was loaded with so many things that it was easy to then knock it down on the grounds that it was a giveaway to this industry or that industry, making these people better off or worse off. And in the meantime, so much time had passed. The Democrats lost the 60th seat in the Senate when they lost the Kennedy seat in Massachusetts and so on. I think looking back on it, and I'm sure histories will be written about the Obama presidency, this is a really sort of tragic error that the president didn't take advantage of this honeymoon period when there were people who in Congress who had to acknowledge that they owed their political career to him and not the other way around.
Thank you, Ricky. We have a couple more questions. Just for the other panelists, if you want to weigh in on any of the conversation, just signal. Why don't we go to the next question?
Yeah, so my name is Liam. What I wanted to ask about is, it sort of seems like our incentive and regulation policy has already successfully gotten clean, carbon-free technologies sort of off the ground, and now would probably need to be more turned to how do we steer them in the direction of what a carbon-free economy would look like. And I was hoping somebody could speak to maybe some guiding policy principles for that. I know that's vague, so I'll give a quick example. You know, if wind energy is going to be a big part of our power, we need to figure out how to adjust for, you know, the intermittency and whatnot, but incentive structures like the production tax credit don't really encourage wind producers to manage that time well because they get rewarded for production any time of day. So how can we adjust our policy, not just to get more clean energy, but sort of direct it so that it's ready for the different economy that would be a carbon-free economy?
Carl and then Nat?
Well, I think that's really a critical question. There's a very interesting study. I won't bore you with all the details. It was done in 2013 by the ISO for California, the Independent System Operator, the folks that actually have to run the grid out there, looking ahead. As you may know, California has a policy of 30% wind and solar, I think in 5 years or something like that. And they were saying, well, how's this going to work? I mean, how are we going to be able to manage not only variability in the load, but also variability in the supply? And some very interesting propositions come out of that study. But I think what it comes down to is, at the end of the day, you're still going to need some dispatchable base load for at least 50 or 60% of your power. And dispatchable meaning that when you need more power from that plant, you can get more power. Nuclear, nuclear is a funny thing. It kind of gets lost in this debate a lot, but I mean, it is the one zero CO2 emitting source that can produce power relatively inexpensively at volume, and it's dispatchable. I think that gas, because of its very quick cycle time, you can turn a gas plant on faster and get it up to load quicker than any other type of power plant is going to be critical at some level to provide that buffer. And it really fits very well with technologies like solar and wind, where you lose that dispatchability. So it's going to be not one solution. It's going to be a multitude of solutions. New dimensions in batteries may have an impact. You're already seeing some of that designed in some of the wind power for very short duration, but it can be a big help in the ISOs in managing the load from these variety of sources.
Just really briefly, I think a lot of it comes back to what we were talking about before about prices that put a price on carbon. Whenever I think about policy, and I think Carl's right, it's going to take a lot of solutions, but no group, this group of people around this table, no group we could put together of the smartest technologists knows what the solution is or could figure out the pathway. The way that we're going to get the reductions we need is to put policies in place that harness the market and let market forces and market entrepreneurs and market decision makers figure out the best way of meeting those goals and to put the incentives around what we care about, which is carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions. So that's why I think market-based policies like a tax or a carbon market are so powerful, because they let the market figure out what the best solutions are to get the goals we need. You can then think about complementary policies to clear the thickets of regulation in state electricity markets or so on to help smooth the way. But the fundamental driver, I think, needs to be economic incentives created by a price on carbon.
Amy?
I just have a question, actually, because I don't know the impact of it. But the Supreme Court recently decided, I thought, a very important case affirming the FERC's authority to basically manage demand-side electricity, and allows them to have a higher rate during peak operating times, which I think is a very, very important tool.
We'll go to another question from the audience.
Hi, my name is Lynn. I have a question. We've talked about environmental justice concerns domestically and also brought up the issue of distributional concerns with developing countries like China and India. Now, my question focuses around environmental justice internationally and the concept of loss and damage. That was really a difficult concept during the Paris Agreement, and how the U.S. and other countries and the dialogue for that is going to move forward in the future with these concerns.
Okay, so a little bit of background. There are sort of three components of climate action. The first is mitigation, so what countries can do to reduce emission. The second is adaptation, what countries can do to adapt to the changing environment. And then the third is loss and damage, which are those things that happen that countries cannot adapt to. So countries entirely disappearing, islands disappearing. It was, and has been for a number of years now, an incredibly contentious issue in the negotiations. developed countries see this as sometimes a request by developing countries for essentially unlimited liability. And developing countries, well, there are obviously a number of developing countries, have had different ideas exactly what loss and damage means. There was a very, very delicate balance struck in Paris. And I think actually much of that has to do with the US being much more flexible than they had ever been before. And in some senses, these questions are left open and will be resolved in the coming years, maybe resolved in the coming years. They'll be discussed in the coming years at least.
With that, I'd like to thank each of the panelists. You were absolutely outstanding, in my humble opinion. Keep up your absolutely great work. I'd like to thank NYU Law for hosting this panel, and in particular, Jeannie Kim, who was terrific to work with in bringing this conversation to you. And finally, my thanks to you, all of you in the audience. You play a really important role. Thank you for being here and participating in this conversation, and I hope that you will use your voice from wherever you sit to raise and share your perspective on these important issues that are going to be with us for many, many years to come. I'd like to especially thank Ambassador Boyden Gray for participating via Skype with us today. It was terrific to have you on the panel, although not here in person, you're with us. And a final moderator's prerogative, I'd like to plug Ricky's book, okay? Struggling for Air. It's Ricky Revesz and Jack Linke, and this might say something about the book, but something about me. I thought this was a page-turner, and I read it in one sitting, so go get the book. Thank you, everyone.